ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm Mark Blunden and this is The Leader. How hot will London be as global temperatures creep upwards? Scientists say there's now a 66% chance the 2015 Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees C global warming threshold will be breached within the next 4 years. In this episode of the Leader podcast, we examine how London could be impacted by the devastating effects of climate change unless urgent action is taken by the government, business and the people. You've seen those often angry confrontations between drivers and Just Stop Oil protesters at flashpoints throughout the capital.
I don't know if you can imagine what it would take to stand in oncoming traffic for this cause, because they care so much, because this is so important.
But while we may not agree with their means, they're undoubtedly shining a light on the challenges we're facing. Breaching 1.5 degrees C annually for a decade or more would see more intense heat waves, even worse than London's recent baking summers, and heightened pollution. To find out what this means for Londoners and our infrastructure, plus how to do your bit, we're joined by Laurie Laybourn, author of Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown.
Any of the things that we see in cities like London, hot moments, cold moments, wet moments, they will all become more extreme. So expect more of the type of extreme heat that we saw last summer, those extraordinary temperatures that led to buildings burning down. We'll probably see more of that. Well, we will see more of that. We will see more flooding, like we've seen with flash flooding across the city as rains have come crashing in, because climate change, hotter global temperatures are making those things more extreme and more frequent. The city itself is in many ways vulnerable to this. This is partly because of old infrastructure, which was made for and in the old world, the world that existed before the big temperature rises that we're experiencing now. So it might not be able to handle things like flooding. It's also not great for handling things like heat, largely because of this urban heat island effect, so-called, where the sun is absorbed into concrete and other buildings, and in the evening it is released, making it hotter. If there was more nature in London, more trees, more green spaces, more plants on buildings, more water as well, it would help with that. And you'll see around the world in other capitals that are in places that are even hotter and getting even hotter, they are starting to green their cities, and that will help absorb flooding. It will help make the city cooler.
And what about factors from further afield?
The other way that London will be affected is that more extremes across the world will damage some of the life support systems that we need. A good example of this is the food system. This year, we've had news stories about how crops like salad crops and other foods have been damaged in parts of the world, which has affected our ability to get those products in the UK. This is just the beginning of those effects to the food system. So it's not just about the weather in the city. It's also about how climate extremes around the world will damage those key systems that we depend on, like the food system.
Can our public transport handle the increased temperatures?
Yeah, the climate crisis will make it warmer to be on public transport, particularly on the tube. Heat waves can cause tracks to expand or buckle. It plays with the metal in the tracks. Colder extremes, which we'll also get, things are just going haywire. You've got to think about this as the climate crisis is making the weather far weirder. So we'll also get moments of freezes, which can damage power lines and also crack and break tracks. Flooding also can enter into places like the tube. It can also erode embankments and cause landslips. We've seen that affecting rail travel into the city. Recent stories include landslips in places like Basingstoke that can abruptly come along and pull tracks away, which could cause crashes. And that can also happen not just with rain, but with drought as well, which can cause subsidence. So think of it as the climate crisis makes weird extreme weather, which starts to pummel transport infrastructure that was built in and for a world that looked very different to the warmer, less stable world that we're heading into now.
What's the risk for older and vulnerable Londoners?
The risk to health for elderly population include limited mobility, a lack of ability to get around, which can mean that they are stuck in places. As the body gets older, on average, it gets less able to handle stress and more extreme conditions. That is partly because people who are in the elderly population can have other conditions, heart, lung problems, which will be stressed by hotter or more extreme weather. Medications that they may have to take regularly can also impact their ability to handle heat. And all of those together are some of the reasons behind why we saw nearly 3,000 excess deaths last year in the over 65s population during the big heat waves we saw across London and the UK.
And how will our pollution levels fare?
The climate crisis, in making the city hotter, will increase air pollution, including these really damaging PM 2.5 particles, because there will just be more dust from dry conditions washing around in the wind. If we don't get on top of the air pollution problem with cars, it will interact with that. So basically, if you've ever been out in London on a dry, hot day and you can feel it even more in your eyes and in your nose, that's partly because there's way more dust matter around because it's drier and that dry, dusty stuff is getting whipped up. On the flip side, there's, as with all of this stuff, there's a huge opportunity because getting rid of one of the main causes of air pollution, which is congested traffic with petrol and diesel cars, will help sort the climate problem out because they all contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but will also help deal with the air pollution problem. And then having a greener city as well with the right types of plants and pools of water and so on will also help deal with the air pollution problem. So on the flip side, there are huge opportunities to sort that out that will make the city healthier anyway.
Let's go to the ads. Coming up, uniting and upgrading the United Kingdom to fight climate change, what you can do. Why not hit rate and follow in the meantime? Welcome back. Now, those Just Stop Oil protesters, their methods aren't everyone's cup of tea, but how can we unite to help save the planet?
I think that the Just Stop Oil protesters are channeling the rage and worry that all of us should, and I think to large degrees do have. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. The climate crisis is now getting so extreme as it heads to 1.5 degrees of heating that we could start to see bits of the global environmental system, the world's life support system, start to abruptly collapse. The Amazon is something that is on the red list to potentially die back. And there are complex bits of the climate system that mean that the UK is relatively warmer than other parts of the world, or they would be as far north as we are, that could start to break down. These will be disasters that far exceed the kind of shock we saw with COVID. So we are in that danger zone, and politicians in particular are not being truthful enough about that. And I sympathise with how Just Stop Oil are channeling the rage and worry that many of us should have. Sitting in the road is not for everyone, particularly if you're on the receiving end of it. So I think that we should see things like Just Stop Oil and ask ourselves the question, well, hang on a minute, if I don't want to go and sit in the road, what is something that maybe is a bit more moderate that I could go and do?
Such as?
Well, it is making sure that you're involved in everything from community groups that are helping install urban farms in London, that are helping deal with air pollution problems, there's loads of little projects for people that are creating a cleaner and healthier city in their local area, and London is great for that. The biggest one, though, is that people have got to get involved in local all the way up to national politics to deal with the root cause of this, which is that a lot of people with a lot of power and a lot of money staked in continuing to allow fossil fuels to be burned are blocking the political system from dealing with this issue. And so it doesn't just mean sitting in the road or standing on a snooker table. There are a whole range of things we can do to make sure we stop these people who want fossil fuels to continue to be burned because they have money from it, blocking our political system and pushing us into a world that none of us want.
So what's stalling this green investment for the future?
I'll give you an example. The hosts of the UN's climate conference this year, we're now on COP28, it's being held in the Middle East, and the head of the conference is also in charge of the country's oil and gas company. And so we got a situation where pretty much an oil and gas company, is in charge of the global climate negotiations for this year. So that's one of a whole range of examples where there is still too much power being given to particularly fossil companies. There are, of course, other companies who are in the game of earning money from fossil fuels that are getting in the way. Another example is in finance and banking. Many banks and firms around the world are invested hugely in fossil fuels and get a lot of their profits from it. So those webs of influence and power around the world are blocking the imagination in policymaking at international and at national levels. We need to make sure we have people in politics who are able to ensure that different policies, like being able to spend the right amounts of public money on green investments and being able to make sure that we are changing the ownership, for example, of fossil fuel companies so that they have different objectives, that those things are on the table. And at the moment, they're being blocked. And if we had more people in politics who put the climate emergency as their number one priority, maybe that could change.
There's more news and features in the Evening Standard newspaper and online at standard.co.uk. That's The Leader. We're back on Friday at 4 p.m.